My stepdaughter killed her own mother by withholding treatment. I didn't flinch. I just looked down at my cracked hands, and then at the hospice director he had subpoenaed, the same man who had watched me hold my mother's hand for 11 straight hours. My name is Phoebe Chandler. I'm 43 years old. I've been a hospice nurse in Sullivan County for almost 20 years. And on the morning of November 18th, in a windowless hearing room that smelled like burnt coffee, my stepfather Keith stood up in front of the State Board of Nursing and told them I had killed my mother for the inheritance. He used the word smothered twice. He cried while he said it. He had a folder of Facebook posts in front of him, printed on real paper, like that meant something in a medical proceeding. I want you to understand something before I go any further. 3 weeks earlier, I had held my mother's hand from 10 o'clock at night until she stopped breathing at 14 minutes past 9 the next morning. I never stood up. I never let go. The hospice director was standing behind me the whole time. Keith was asleep in the guest room. Now, sitting at the respondents' table with my blue State Board of Nursing credentials badge, worn and frayed at the edges from 20 years of service, clipped to the front of my coat, I rubbed my thumb across the split skin on my knuckles and felt the sting open up again. The HVAC was on full blast. My hands had started bleeding before I even sat down. My mother's name was Ruth. She was 68. She'd been a kindergarten teacher for 31 years, and she made a hand salve every Christmas from beeswax and calendula she grew in pots on her kitchen windowsill. The last jar she ever made sat in the chest pocket of my scrubs, while Keith told the board I was a monster. 2 ounces of amber glass, almost empty. The label read, in her looping cursive, "For my girl's hands." I'd been rubbing it into my knuckles every night for 8 months. It was the only thing that kept them from cracking open completely. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start in that hearing room. It starts the night Ruth's oncologist told her the tumor in her left lung had spread to her liver, and there was nothing left to fight. She looked at the doctor. Then she looked at me. Then she said, "I want to go home, and I want Phoebe to take care of me." Keith was in the room. He didn't say anything. He just took out his phone and started typing. That was the first post. Praying through the hardest news of our lives. Please keep Ruth in your hearts. No mention of me. No mention that Ruth had already named me as her medical power of attorney 6 years earlier, before she ever met him. He'd been her husband for 4 years. I'd been her daughter for 43. I moved into her living room the next week. I set up a hospital bed by the front window so she could see the maple tree she'd planted when I was 9. I brought my own equipment from work. The CAD pump for the morphine, its mechanical, rhythmic click, already as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. The suction unit for the secretions. The flow sheets for the medication log, because hospice protocol requires you document every dose, every time, with a signature and a timestamp. Keith watched me set everything up. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, "You're really going to make this a hospital in here?" I said, "It's what she asked for." He said, "Well, she doesn't always know what she wants." A week later, he stood in the doorway while I was drawing up a dose and said, "You're just a glorified pill pusher. You don't know what she actually wanted. You just wanted it over with." I did not answer him. I finished drawing the dose. I signed the sheet. I should have known then. But I was already exhausted, and I had a patient to take care of, and the patient was my mother. The next 4 months were the hardest work of my life, and I have done this work for almost 20 years. I have sat with strangers while they died. I have managed pain crises at 3 in the morning in trailers and mansions and one-bedroom apartments above a bakery. I have learned to read the exact moment a body begins to let go. None of it prepared me for doing it to my own mother. I slept on the couch in 2-hour increments. Every 2 hours I got up, repositioned her to prevent pressure sores, swabbed her mouth with glycerin sticks, checked the pump, logged the dose, and signed the sheet. Then I lay back down and listened to her breathe through the baby monitor I'd clipped to the lampshade. My hands were cracking by week 3. The institutional sanitizer I use at work is bad enough. Doing it 40 times a day in a private home, in dry autumn air, with no break, with my knuckles already raw from 20 years of the job, was something else. By October, the skin across the back of my hands looked like a dry riverbed. Some nights, I'd wash up after a bed change, and the splits would open and bleed into the sink, and I'd just stand there watching the water run pink, too tired to do anything about it. I'll tell you the truth about something because I think you'll understand. There was one night, around 3 in the morning, when I'd just changed Ruth's brief and gotten her settled, and I went into the bathroom to wash up, and my knuckles split open in 4 places at once. I sat down on the bath mat. I let myself cry for exactly 2 minutes. I timed it. I have a watch I use to time medication intervals, and I used it to time my own crying, because if I cried longer than that, I would not be able to draw up the next dose without my hands shaking. And shaking hands and morphine syringes do not belong in the same room. Then I stopped. I rubbed Ruth's salve into the cuts. I went back out to the living room and signed the next entry on the flow sheet at 3:14 a.m. in handwriting that did not shake. That is what Keith later described to the state board as cold. I want to be honest about that too. I was cold around him. I was clipped. I was clinical. Because if I let my feelings into that room while I was drawing up morphine, I would make a mistake. And the mistake would cost my mother her comfort in the last weeks of her life. So I kept my face still and my voice level, and I did the work. He saw that and decided it meant I didn't love her. I am not going to pretend that didn't cost something. He wasn't entirely wrong that I had walled myself off. I just walled myself off from him, specifically, because every time he came into the room, he tried to make her death about him. He sat by the bed in the afternoons and held her hand for the camera. He'd angle his phone, lean in close, get the light right, take 3 or 4 shots, then go through and pick the best one. He'd type a caption. He'd post it. Then he'd let go of her hand and walk into the kitchen to refresh his coffee. The first time I saw one of those posts, I almost said something. He had cropped me out. I was in the original photo, sitting on the other side of the bed with my hand on Ruth's forearm. But in the version he posted, I'd been cut off at the elbow. The caption said, "Day 47 of my vigil. She squeezed my hand today. Every moment is a gift." She had not squeezed his hand. I had been adjusting her IV line at that exact moment, and her arm had jerked involuntarily because the tubing pulled against the tape. I documented it in the flow sheet under involuntary motor response, left arm, secondary to line tension. He documented it on Facebook as a miracle. If you've ever watched someone dig their own grave with their mouth, you know what comes next. Stay with me. Within a few weeks, Keith had built a parallel version of my mother's death online. In his version, he was the devoted husband keeping vigil. In his version, the doctors had given up, but he was praying her through it. In his version, there was a daughter somewhere in the background who was handling the medical side, but who had very different ideas about end-of-life care than the family. He never used my name in the posts. He referred to me as the hospice nurse or the medical professional in the family. Strangers in the comments started asking who this nurse was and why she wasn't letting Ruth fight harder. Keith would reply with prayer hands emojis and the phrase, "We're trusting God's timing, but it's complicated." The neighbor, Eleanor Gable, was the first one to ask me directly. She showed up with a casserole in late September and stood on the porch and said, "Phoebe, honey, are you sure she shouldn't be in a hospital?" I said, "She signed an advance directive 2 years ago. She wants to be home." Eleanor said, "Keith mentioned you've taken over all the decisions." I said, "I followed the advance directive." Eleanor smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're lying. She handed me the casserole and left. The hairdresser, Brenda Miller, called the house 2 weeks after that and asked to speak to Ruth. Ruth was in a morphine-managed sleep at the time and could not hold a phone. I told Brenda I'd pass along the message. Brenda said, "Keith told me you were screening her calls." I didn't believe him, but I guess he was right. I hung up the phone, washed my hands, signed the next entry, and didn't think about Brenda Miller again for 2 months. Keith stopped including me in the family text thread sometime in early October. I noticed because Ruth's sister, who lives in Vermont, called me directly to ask how the funeral arrangements were going. I said, "She's still alive." There was a long pause. Then her sister said, "Keith told us last Thursday she'd be gone by the weekend. He said you were keeping her comfortable until then." I said, "She's awake right now. She had broth this morning." Her sister started crying. I started to realize in pieces that Keith was telling a version of events to everyone in our family that bore no relationship to what was actually happening in that living room. He was running a campaign, and I was the villain in it, and I was too tired and too busy to fight back. I also didn't think it mattered. My mother was dying. Whatever Keith wanted to tell his Facebook friends could not change that. The medication was in my hands. The flow sheet was on the table. The advance directive was in the binder by the bed, signed and witnessed and notarized. I had the only thing that mattered, which was the legal authority to do what Ruth had asked me to do. I was wrong about it not mattering. I was wrong in a way I didn't understand until almost 3 weeks after she died. When I came home from a double shift, stood at my mailbox in the cold, and opened a certified letter from the Sullivan County office of the State Board of Nursing. The letter was 4 pages long. It informed me that a formal complaint had been filed against my license. The complainant alleged that I had withheld medically necessary treatment from a vulnerable adult in my care for the purpose of accelerating her death and the disbursement of her estate. The letter named the deceased patient, Ruth Chandler, my mother. The complainant was listed on page 2. Keith. The letter informed me that I had 21 days to submit a written response and that an emergency suspension hearing had been scheduled for November 18th. If I did not respond, my license would be suspended automatically pending investigation. If I did respond, I would be required to appear in person at the Sullivan County boardroom and answer the allegations under oath. I stood at the mailbox for a long time. The cold had numbed my hands enough that I didn't feel the skin splitting again. When I finally went inside and washed up at the kitchen sink, I watched the water run pink down the drain and thought about my mother's hand on the last morning. The way the silence in the room had shifted in a single instant after her last breath. A distinct, total change in the air that every hospice nurse learns to recognize and never forgets. And then her fingers going slack at 14 minutes past 9, the way Marcus Vance had put his hand on my shoulder and said, "She's gone, Phoebe. You can let go now." Marcus was the director of Sullivan County Hospice Care. He had been the one who came to the house at midnight on the last night, driving out in the dark to authorize the final morphine increase and countersign the order, and then staying. He had stood behind me the rest of the way. I hadn't let go. Not for another 20 minutes. I had sat there holding her hand until the warmth left it, because I had promised her I would, and because there was nobody else in that house who was going to do it. Keith had been in the kitchen making coffee. I responded to the letter on day 3. I submitted my flow sheets, the advance directive, the hospice protocol documentation, and a statement from my employer confirming that I had been working under direct supervision of the Sullivan County Hospice Care Medical Director during the entire period in question. I didn't sleep much in those 21 days. My knuckles bled through 2 pairs of work gloves. I finished almost all of the salve. On the morning of November 18th, I drove to the county building in a coat that smelled like institutional chlorhexidine sanitizer and parked in a lot 2 blocks away because the closer lot was full. I walked the 2 blocks with my hands in my coat pockets, pressing my thumb against the split skin on my right ring knuckle, feeling it sting. The November air was so dry it felt like glass against my face. By the time I reached the front steps of the county building, my hands were aching from the cold, and the cuts had reopened along 3 of my fingers. I went through the metal detector. The guard noticed my hands and didn't say anything. The Sullivan County boardroom was on the 3rd floor at the end of a hallway, lit by fluorescents that hummed at a pitch I could feel in my teeth. Windowless. Recycled air. A folding table in the corner held a coffee carafe that smelled like it had been on the burner since 7 a.m. There were 8 chairs at the central table, arranged in a U, 3 on each side for the parties, and 2 at the head for the chairman and the recording secretary. Behind the U, 2 rows of leather chairs for witnesses and observers. Keith was already seated when I walked in. He was 62 years old, and wearing a navy suit I had never seen before, and a tie with small crosses embroidered on it. His lawyer, a man named Hollis, was leaning toward him, whispering something. Keith was nodding the way he nodded in church, slow and grave, like he was receiving counsel from God himself. Behind him, in the 2nd row of leather chairs, sat Marcus Vance. Marcus was in a gray suit, his leather folio resting flat across his knees. He met my eyes once when I walked in, gave a single small nod, and then went back to looking at the folio. He did not look at Keith. Keith did not turn around to look at him. I sat down on the opposite side of the table. I had no lawyer. My union representative had offered to come, and I had told her no, because I had read the chart, and I had signed every line of it, and I did not need anyone to translate my own work to a room of medical professionals. The chairman came in at 9 sharp. His name was Dr. Halverson. He had been on the Sullivan County Board for 11 years. He sat down, opened a binder, looked at Keith, then at me, then at the room. "This is an emergency suspension hearing in the matter of complaint number 24-1147, Chandler. We're on the record. Complainant, you may proceed." Hollis stood up first and gave a brief opening statement about the gravity of elder abuse and the importance of the board's oversight function. Then he sat down, and Keith was sworn in. Keith placed his right hand on the Bible Hollis had brought from home. He swore to tell the truth. He sat down in the witness chair and adjusted the microphone and took a long, performative breath. "My wife, Ruth, was the love of my life," he began. I rubbed my thumb across my knuckles under the table. The cut stung. Keith spoke for 40 minutes. He described Ruth's diagnosis. He described the day she came home from the oncologist and told him she didn't want any more treatment. He said he had begged her to fight. He said he had prayed over her every night. He said that when Phoebe, that's how he referred to me, when Phoebe moved into the house, he noticed a change in his wife immediately. She became withdrawn. She stopped eating. She stopped praying with him. Keith thought his Facebook posts were a legal medical record. He didn't realize the state board requires flow sheets, and he didn't realize who signed them. He produced a stack of printed Facebook posts. Hollis entered them as exhibits. Keith walked the board through each one. The photograph of him holding Ruth's hand, captioned, "Day 40 of my vigil. Please pray." The photograph of the morphine pump on the bedside table, captioned, "They keep increasing the dose. I don't know how much longer." The photograph of Ruth's empty chair at the kitchen table, captioned, "She barely comes downstairs anymore. The nurse says it's time." He never once said my name in the captions. In every photograph I had been cropped out at the edge, my shoulder visible in one, my forearm in another. In the one of the pump, my hand was on the side of the frame, holding the tubing, and the caption made it sound like Ruth had administered it herself. "I documented everything," Keith told the board, "because I knew, in my heart, something wasn't right." He produced the witness letters next. Eleanor Gable, who lived across the street and had brought casseroles twice. Brenda Miller, who had cut Ruth's hair for 16 years. Both letters said the same thing in different handwriting. Phoebe was cold. Phoebe controlled the room. Phoebe wouldn't let Ruth speak for herself. Phoebe seemed eager. Eager. That was the word both of them had used. I wondered which one of them Keith had coached. Hollis took Keith through the financial section next. Ruth's will. The house. The small life insurance policy. The fact that Phoebe was the sole beneficiary because Keith and Ruth had signed a prenuptial agreement 4 years earlier when they married. She knew she was getting everything, Keith said. His voice cracked on cue. And the faster it happened, the sooner she could collect. Dr. Halverson made a note. 2 of the other board members made notes. I kept my hands under the table and pressed my thumb harder into the split knuckle. A small bead of blood came up. I wiped it on the inside of my coat pocket. Hollis asked Keith about the final night. This was where Keith made his mistake, and I saw it coming the way you see a patient's respiration shift before the family does. There is a particular kind of confidence a liar develops when nobody has interrupted him for 40 minutes. He starts to believe his own performance. He starts to embellish. "The last night was the worst night of my life," Keith said. Ruth was suffering. She was crying out. And Phoebe, she had increased the morphine to a level that, I'm not a doctor, but I knew it was too much. I told her, I said, "We need to take her to the hospital." And Phoebe refused. She said it was Ruth's wishes, but Ruth couldn't even speak by that point. How would she know? He paused, took another breath, looked at the ceiling. And then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I came downstairs to check on them, and Phoebe wasn't there. She had left my wife alone in the dark, in that bed, dying. I found out later she was upstairs going through Ruth's filing cabinet, looking for the will, while my wife was taking her last breaths, alone. The room was very quiet. The HVAC hummed, The coffee carafe gurgled once and went silent. I did not look at Keith. I did not look at the board. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap now, the split skin red against the pale of my palms, and I waited. There was a small sound behind Keith, the soft creak of a leather chair, the rustle of paper sliding from a folio. Mr. Chairman. Marcus Vance was standing. He had not been called. He had not been recognized. He was standing in the second row of chairs with the leather folio open in his left hand and a single sheet of paper in his right. Hollis turned in his chair, eyes widening. He half stood. He reached toward Keith's arm. Mr. Chairman, the witness is out of order. He hasn't been... Mr. Chairman. Marcus's voice was the same voice he used with families at 3 a.m. when something had to be said, and there was no soft way to say it. I am subpoenaed here today by the complainant, but I will not sit here and let him perjure himself about what happened in that room. Dr. Halverson looked at Hollis, looked at Keith, whose face had gone the color of recycled paper, looked at Marcus. You are the complainant's witness, Mr. Vance. He has the right to examine you first. He can examine me, Marcus said, but I would like to enter a document into the record before the examination begins, so that the questions can be informed by the facts. Hollis was on his feet now. Mr. Chairman, we object. We move to withdraw the witness. Mr. Vance is no longer needed for our case. Dr. Halverson took off his glasses. He set them down on his binder very deliberately. He looked at Keith, who had not moved, whose right hand was still resting on the witness table, as if he had forgotten it was attached to him. Counsel, Dr. Halverson said, the witness has been sworn in by subpoena. You don't get to unsubpoena him because you don't like what he's about to say. Mr. Vance, please come forward. Marcus walked around the second row of chairs and came up to the side of the U. He laid the leather folio open on the table. The page he held up was a hospice flow sheet, 11 inches by 14, with timestamps down the left margin and intervention codes across the top, and 2 columns of signatures down the right side. The page was dense with ink. This is the certified nursing flow sheet from the night of September the 4th into the morning of September the 5th, Marcus said. It documents every intervention administered to Ruth Chandler during her final 12 hours. It is signed at every entry by the attending nurse and countersigned by myself, the director of Sullivan County Hospice Care, who was physically present in the home from 23:45 on the 4th until 9:30 on the morning of the 5th. He tapped the bottom of the page with one finger. My signature appears on this document 14 times. Keith's leather chair squeaked. He shifted his weight. His mouth opened slightly. Marcus did not look at him. He looked at the board. At 2200 hours on September the 4th, Phoebe Chandler administered the scheduled morphine dose per the standing palliative protocol authorized by Dr. Reyes and signed into the advance directive by Ruth Chandler on June the 12th of this year. The patient's respiration was already showing Cheney-Stokes patterning at that point. Oxygen had been discontinued at the patient's prior written request because at that stage it was no longer palliative and was prolonging the dying process against her stated wishes. He turned the page. At 23:45, Phoebe called me at home and requested I come to the residence to authorize a comfort increase. I arrived at the house at 15 past midnight. I authorized the increase. I countersigned the order. I remained in the room. He looked up from the page for the first time, looked at the board, did not look at Keith. Your stepdaughter, he said, and the word stepdaughter landed in the room like a dropped instrument. Didn't abandon her in the dark. She administered the protocol perfectly. And then she held her mother's hand from 10 p.m. until her final breath at 9:14 a.m. 11 straight hours without standing up. I know, because I was standing right behind her. The fluorescent lights hummed. Keith made a small sound. Not a word. A breath. That was being cold, he said. She didn't even cry. Dr. Halverson turned his head slowly toward Keith. I lifted my eyes for the first time in 20 minutes. I looked at Keith across the U of the table. His face had collapsed inward, the performance grief gone, replaced by something smaller and more frightened. Hollis had his hand on Keith's forearm now, squeezing, trying to stop him from speaking. I spoke before I had decided to. Comfort isn't about fighting the inevitable so you can feel like a hero, Keith. It's about not letting them face it alone. He looked at me. His eyes were wet, but I could not tell if it was real. You didn't ask where I was that night, I said. Because you were asleep in the guest room. The room did not move. The HVAC hummed. The coffee carafe gurgled. Somewhere down the hallway, a copier started running, and the smell of warm toner drifted faintly under the door. Hollis stood up. Mr. Chairman, we'd like to formally withdraw Mr. Vance as a witness, and we'd like a brief recess to confer with our call. Dr. Halverson took off his glasses again. He set them down. He looked directly at Keith, and then at Hollis, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet and very flat. The witness will finish his statement. Marcus Vance did not sit down. He turned a single page in the folio. The paper made a dry sound that everyone in the room heard. At 0100 on September 5th, I administered a secondary bolus per the standing order. At 0215, the patient's respiration shifted to Cheney-Stokes. Phoebe Chandler identified the pattern within 90 seconds and informed me. At 0340, agonal breathing began. The patient's hand was held continuously by her daughter throughout. At 0700, I offered to relieve Phoebe so she could use the restroom. She declined. At 0914, the patient expired. Time of death was called by me. The daughter was still holding the hand. I had to ask her, twice, to let go so I could perform post-mortem care. He closed the folio. That is the medical record. It is signed, time-stamped, and on file with Sullivan County Hospice Care. I will entertain any questions from the board. Dr. Halverson did not ask questions. He looked down the table at the woman on his left, who shook her head once. He looked at the man on his right. Another small shake. He turned to Keith. Mr. Chandler, the board has heard sufficient testimony. Hollis tried again. Mr. Chairman, my client has the right to... Counselor. Dr. Halverson's voice did not rise. Sit down. Hollis sat. This board finds the complaint against Phoebe Chandler, RN, license number redacted on the record, to be without clinical merit. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Further, this board finds the complaint to have been filed in bad faith based on testimony heard today, and we will be referring the matter to our legal counsel for review under our frivolous filing statute. Ms. Chandler, you are free to go. The board apologizes for the disruption to your professional standing and to your grief. He hit the small wooden block with the small wooden gavel. Once. I did not stand up right away. I rubbed my thumb across the split on my middle knuckle. The skin had bled a little during Vance's testimony, a thin red line I had not noticed. I felt it now. The sting was almost a relief. Keith was looking at the table. His phone was face down beside his water glass, He did not pick it up. I stood. I walked past him. I did not look at him. In the hallway, Marcus Vance caught up with me. He did not say anything dramatic. He just put his hand on my shoulder for 2 seconds and then let it drop. "You should take a few days," he said. "I have a new admit Thursday." He nodded. He had known I would say that. He had probably rehearsed asking anyway. The cold outside the building hit my hands first. The skin tightened. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat with the engine off for a long time, looking at nothing. I did not cry in the parking lot. I had done my crying already, in a living room at 3 a.m, with my mother's salve worked into my knuckles. There was no more crying left for this. The news traveled the way news travels in small towns. Not through me. Eleanor Gable found out first from a paralegal at Hollis's office who went to her church. She called Brenda Miller. Brenda called the woman who organized the prayer chain. The prayer chain stopped praying for Keith. I heard about it from my cousin Annette, who heard about it from her hairdresser, who was not Brenda, but knew Brenda. Annette called me on a Tuesday evening while I was eating a sandwich over the sink. "Brenda is telling everyone she was misled," Annette said. "She's saying Keith showed her the Facebook posts and told her you wouldn't let Ruth eat solid food at the end. She's telling people she didn't know about hospice. She's saying she feels sick about her statement." "She is welcome to feel sick about it," I said. "Eleanor won't say his name anymore. She crosses the street." "Okay." The church moved his name off the deacon list, quietly. They didn't announce it. They just stopped putting it in the bulletin. "Okay." Annette was quiet for a moment. "Phoebe, are you going to do anything?" I already did something. I held her hand for 11 hours. I hung up before she could answer. I rinsed my plate. I went to bed at 8:30. The text came 9 days after the hearing. I was in the break room at the hospice office, charting on a tablet, drinking coffee that had been on the burner since the morning shift. My phone buzzed face down on the laminate table. I turned it over. "Your mother would want us to heal. Can we talk?" "Coffee." My treat. "K." I looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. I did not feel rage. I did not feel vindication. I felt the same flat tiredness I felt at the end of any long shift, the kind of tired where your body has stopped registering individual aches and registers only weight. He had not apologized. He had not said her name. He had said, "Your mother would want." The way he had always said it, the way that put words in her mouth she had never spoken, the way that made his comfort her wish. I held my thumb down on the message. I selected delete. I confirmed delete. The bubble disappeared. I blocked the number. I went back to charting. That was the last conversation I will ever have with Keith, and he was not part of it. November turned brittle. The kind of cold that does not snow, just dries everything down to its bones. My knuckles cracked every morning. The jar of salve in my scrub pocket had maybe a half teaspoon left in the bottom. I had been rationing it without admitting I was rationing it. On a Saturday, I drove to the cemetery. Sullivan County Memorial sits on a low hill behind a hardware store and a feed supply. Ruth's plot is in the newer section, near a young oak that the groundskeeper had staked against the wind. The grass was yellow. The headstone was simple. Granite, her name, the dates, and underneath, in the smaller line she had picked herself before she stopped being able to pick things. She was kind, and she was here. I sat down on the grass beside her. The cold came up through my jeans immediately. I took the jar out of my pocket. The amber glass had a smudge of fingerprint on it, mine, from 1,000 opens and closes. I unscrewed the lid. The smell came up, beeswax and calendula, and something else, something faint, that was just her kitchen. There was not much left. I scraped what there was with my thumbnail. I worked it into the split on my middle knuckle, into the cracks along my ring finger, into the dry place at the base of my thumb where the skin had been peeling for a week. The salve was warm against the cold. The sting eased. I sat with the empty jar in my palm. I read her handwriting on the label. For my girl's hands. The ink had faded a little on the Gian girl. She had written it standing at the kitchen counter the November before she got sick, the November she still thought she had years. I did not put the jar back in my pocket. I set it on the headstone, on the small, flat ledge above her name. I left it there. "Okay, Mom," I said. That was all I said. I sat for another minute. Then I stood up, brushed the dry grass off my jeans, and walked back to my car. The next admit was on Cedar Street, a small ranch with a wheelchair ramp built recently enough that the wood was still pale. Mrs. Doyle, 81, end-stage COPD, 3 children, one of whom would be difficult. Marcus had warned me about the daughter on the phone. I parked. I got my bag out of the back seat. The cold caught my knuckles again and the new salve held. The daughter answered the door. Her eyes were red. She had not slept. "You must be the nurse." "I'm Phoebe. I'm going to take care of your mother." She nodded. She did not know what to do with her hands. Nobody ever does, the first day. I followed her down the hallway. The house smelled like cigarettes from 40 years ago and lemon cleaner from this morning. A clock ticked somewhere. A small dog barked once from a back room and was hushed. Mrs. Doyle was in the front bedroom, propped on 3 pillows, an oxygen cannula in her nose. Her eyes opened when I came in. I set my bag on the chair by the door. I unzipped it. I pulled out the box of nitrile gloves. I peeled 2 from the box. I snapped the first one over my left hand. The nitrile stretched over the salve, over the cracked skin, over the knuckles that had been a courtroom exhibit 9 days ago and were now just hands again. Just my hands, the ones I had been given for this. I snapped the second glove over my right. I walked to the side of the bed. I sat down in the chair her daughter had pulled close. I took Mrs. Doyle's hand. "Hi," I said. "I'm Phoebe. I'm going to be with you." She looked at me. She squeezed my fingers, weakly, the way they all do at the start. I squeezed back. There is no glory in the quiet work. There is only the work. And the work is enough. If you're still with me, I want you to think about something. Think about the people in your life who do the hard, unseen things. The ones who don't post about it. The ones whose hands are cracked and whose eyes have circles, and who get called cold because they didn't fall apart when falling apart wasn't an option. Think about whether you've ever mistaken composure for indifference in someone you loved. And if you have, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me whose hand you held, or whose hand held yours. I read them. All of them. And if this story meant something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe. Give this one a like. Ring the bell so the next one finds you. I have more stories to tell, and I think you'll want to hear them. Stay warm out there. The cold is hard on the hands.